Hi, I'm Mordechai Torchiner with Beit Midrash Zichron Adov, and this is the first in a series of daily videos from our Beit Midrash related to Pesach. To receive these videos in your email every day, please go to the link in the description below. My video is about the 114th chapter of the book of Tehillim, of Psalms. It's the second chapter in Hallel, which we say during Pesach. And it begins, B'tzeit Yisrael mi-Mitzrayim, Beit Yaakov me'am lo ez. At the time when Israel left Egypt, when the house of Jacob left, Am lo ez, a nation with a foreign tongue, a nation that spoke a foreign language. And it goes on to describe the great feats that Hashem performed on behalf of the Jews. It talks about splitting the sea. It talks about giving the Torah at Sinai. And it describes nature fleeing before God on our behalf. And it says that nature flees because God is the former of the earth and the God of Yaakov, and he has the power to change everything as he chooses, including bringing water forth from a stone, and so on. That's the basics of the chapter. But I want to focus on the beginning of the chapter, in which Egypt is described as Am lo ez, a nation that speaks a foreign language. Because really, of all the things that I could have said to describe Egypt, that doesn't come to mind. I could have described them as slave drivers, right? I could have described them as ungrateful to the family of Joseph. There's an awful lot of things you can say about Egypt to describe how bad their enslavement of the Jews was. The fact that they're Am lo ez, that they speak a different language, doesn't really seem to rank. So what's this about? Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra suggests that lo ez is meant to demonstrate that they are our antagonists, that they don't like us. Basically, the term la'az, as it's used rabbinically, often means negative speech. And we find in the beginning of the Egyptian plot against the Jews that, in fact, they spoke harshly about us and plotted to harm us. And when we say Am lo ez, we don't mean that they speak a different language, that they spoke a negative language about us. They were our antagonists. One approach. Second approach, this approach is brought in Rashi. It's that they were strangers speaking a foreign tongue, and therefore they were not sympathetic to us. Rashi points to a sentence in the prophet Yeshaya in chapter 33, in which we find the idea of speaking a foreign tongue as seeing someone else as other and not being sympathetic, and in fact being cruel to them. Professor Amos Chacham, in the Da'at Mikra edition of Tehillim of Psalms, points out that we actually have precedent for this in the Chumash itself, when we describe the Jews being exiled to a nation whose language you do not know, and there that nation whose language you do not know is described as being cruel to us. So a second approach is not that they are antagonistic to us, but they're not sympathetic to us. They're strangers. They speak one language, we speak a different language. But I'd like to float a third idea, and that is that we're not describing Egypt as a nation of a foreign tongue in order to say that the Egyptians are antagonistic to us or unsympathetic to us. Rather, we use that as credit to us. And if you take a look back at this entire chapter of Tehillim of Psalms, you'll see what I mean. The chapter begins, as I said, with two verses that describe the Jews, the house of Israel, leaving Egypt as God's holy nation. And then it describes the splitting of the sea and so on. And it concludes by saying that these miracles happen before God, creator of the land and God of Yaakov, who converts stone into sources of water. God who brings water from a stone. And we're describing here then, in the opening passage, God taking the Jews out of Egypt, and the concluding one, God drawing water from a stone. We're trying to make a parallel here to say that the Exodus is like taking water out of a stone. Now, water is not stone. It's a separate material. It has its own identity. And the Jews in Egypt were not Egyptian, even though we find in the book of Yehoshua, in the book of Yechezkel, in Tehillim, that the Jews actually did fall into idolatry, or some of the Jews fell into idolatry in Egypt. Nonetheless, we retained a unique identity. We were like water within a stone. And I think Tehillim captures that unique identity by describing the exoticism of the Egyptian language. It was a foreign tongue. Because we viewed Egypt as a nation of a foreign tongue, we merited to leave that land as God's holy nation. The phrase, Me'am Lo'ez, a nation that speaks a foreign language, actually testifies to the greatness of our ancestors. And so we are told in the beginning of Sefer Devarim, the book of Devarim, chapter 4, that God drew out a nation from the midst of another nation. We were already a separate entity. We needed only to be extracted from the midst of Egypt. This paragraph of Hallel is more than just a declaration that God took us out of Egypt, split the sea, made the mountains caper. It's describing how we merited those wonders. Because we made ourselves alien in Egypt, we were like water within a stone, and God drew us out. May we always retain our own language, and so merit to fulfill the prediction found in Tehillim Kuf Yudalid in chapter 114 in Psalms, for Yehuda to be God's sanctuary and Israel to be God's domain. Thank you very much.